Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alo Bembe NX Natural Processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video where it finished third place out of 8 Coffea Circulor coffees on that day. And this coffee did stand out for being the cleanest of the more processed coffees that were featured on that table on that day. So I was hoping that this coffee would continue to remain that way throughout. So it'll be interesting to see if that was the case, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. Brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. As mentioned in our most recent Coffea Circulor review, the coffees that we've received from them in this most recent set are a little bit more similar to some of the earlier experiences we've had from them, ranging from the 2020 to 2023 range, which we'd previously described as being on the lighter side of things. Now, Coffea Circulor is never going to be the super or ultra light roasting coffee roaster in comparison to some of the other European contemporaries, but even then, in comparison to even some of the Scandinavian coffee roasters that we do review on this channel, they do skew a little lighter overall, and that was the case with this one as well, which is another coffee that we will identify as being on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, our blind taste test day, and this coffee did stand out due to the wild spiced IPA bergamot-like characteristic that was pretty prominent, but outside of that, once it did cool down, there was a slightly tart aspect that was in line with the listed red currant, but it was also relatively clean, especially in comparison to some of the other coffees on that table, which all of them weren't particularly clean, and this one still not necessarily being to the same extent as the washed coffees that we did have on that table, made for an unusual first impression, but it did stand out given the unique qualities and characteristics of this coffee in comparison to the other ones. I do have to say, third place was a pretty decent finish given some of the other coffees on that table, so we took it, and we'll go ahead and move on from there, as on day 18. We opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was even more strange this time around, as it does continue to offer that prominent spiced bergamot-like IPA characteristic to it, but it also has a fair bit of depth as it cools down into an abundance of the listed stone fruit qualities and a slight tartness as well, so it's still been pretty strange as of this moment. And one thing that's really worth highlighting is that we had mentioned that same spiced IPA characteristic in the most recent review that we had from Coffea Circulor as well, the Kiburi WX. And I mentioned that it is an ever-present quality from so many of the coffees that we've had from them dating back years, so it wasn't too surprising that once again we got that same sort of experience from this coffee as well. Let's go ahead and move on to day 21 as we opted for the UFO brewer, and the coffee does continue to remain a little strange as there's even more of that spiced bergamot IPA feel characteristic to it. But the coffee does cool down surprisingly well with more of the listed stone fruit and tart qualities in a pretty well-defined sense. My biggest grievance and issue of this coffee was that spiced quality just really seemed to dominate and highlight the entirety of the initial experience of this coffee. So I don't like that quality. I've said that plenty of times, and it has been a hindering point for me with Coffea Circulor's coffees in the past, but the cooldown itself was very enjoyable, so my goal was to get more of that from this coffee while less of the spiced characteristic. Day 24 through the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the coffee was extremely lovely today as it was offering one of the cleanest and best defined presentations of a natural processed coffee that I'd had this year altogether, as the nectarine and mango are both super abundant with a slight tartness in the finish, but for the most part it was a super fresh fruit, stone fruit forward experience, lending itself towards an absolutely wonderful day. The note they have listed on here on multiple occasions is nectarine, and in addition to that, mango, but I was experiencing all of the stone fruit characteristics in such a clean and fresh fruit forward sense that it made for one of the best days I'd experienced of any natural processed coffee this entire year, and I was really impressed by it. In addition to that, just like with the Kiburi, it seemed to completely drop all of those spiced characteristics around this post 3-week mark, which was consistent with the coffees we got as well. I really don't know what to make of that, but once again, another consistent quality that we've experienced from this coffee roaster in general. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was a little less impressive today as it is marred by the previously mentioned spiced bergamot characteristic to it. So that, however, has been inconsistent within this coffee as it seemed to be floating in and out with the overall experiences that we did have. There's a wild stone fruit quality to it that's buried underneath that extremely strong spiced characteristic. So this was okay, and it was really frustrating to see just how beautiful this coffee can be in one regard, while at the same time how it can be hindered by such an overbearing quality as well. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe. And surprisingly, the coffee was the best that it had been to this point, which does give it even more inconsistency as it has much more of that listed nectarine characteristic. Once again, very fresh fruit, stone fruit forward characteristics with that slight tartness to give it some depth, but it was just extremely clean and well defined, even more so than the first experience that we did have of this coffee and the one we'd experienced when brewing it with Coffea Circulor's recipe. Day 36 through the Chemex with these same adjustments, and the coffee is still nice but not as impressive as it does have an abundance of these stone fruit qualities and tartness to the berries, but it isn't quite as stone fruit, fresh fruit forward as it had been through the V60, so mixed impressions overall. And the final notes that we do have on day 42 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it is back to being highlighted by the fresh fruit qualities as it does have a nice level of clarity with the emphasis being on the stone fruit characteristics, especially in the listed nectarine-like sense. More of the tart berry qualities are still present. I do have to say that they're secondary in comparison to the stone fruit characteristics, but otherwise it does have a tropical citrus that is in line with the listed star fruit. Truth be told, that's probably a bit of a stretch. I can't quite recall too much what star fruit tastes like, but it does have a citric tropicality to it, so that did give this coffee some additional fruit depth. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through them. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. It isn't a stretch if you disregard the spiced bergamot characteristic to this one, because that in itself would certainly hinder this coffee enough to the point where it would reach the level 3 mark. But even then, it's somewhere between the 3 and the 4, because buried underneath that is a very well-defined stone fruit characteristic of this coffee that in itself would justify a level 4 mark. But this coffee was so tricky. I do have to say that half of the days were a level 3, half of the days were a level 4. At its very best, it was a very enjoyable level 4 cleanliness for this one, as there's terrific definition to the fruit qualities and characteristics of this coffee. It's just that they're not always as transparent as they could be in comparison to other days. So pretty inconsistent in that sense. Level 4 though, it did seem to tip the scales given that it was probably closer to 3.5 on those days anyway. Finish, level 4. Coffee not overbearing whatsoever. It does have a lingering fruit characteristic to it, not really surprising, and it does come a lot of the time in that slightly more tart sense, which is unique. One of the unique characteristics of this coffee was seeing the current note that they had listed on here. I can't quite recall having ever seen any natural Ethiopian coffee have a current note, but that was very pronounced within this coffee. Plenty of tart characteristics to it, possibly the priming effect at play, but for the most part, it was, I want to say, secondary to the very well-pronounced fresh fruit, stone fruit characteristics. Sweetness, level 4, all of that came in the fruit sense, and I'm very happy that it did come in that fruit sense because there were such an abundant quality of the stone fruit sweetness throughout the entirety of this coffee. And even then, I can say the other things, the tropical sweetness was pretty prominent, and for that reason, level 4 is more than justified. Very good representation of what I would hope for from a sweetness in a natural processed coffee, from the sweetness in a natural processed coffee. All right, let's go and move on to the fruit characteristics. Berry fruit, level 4. As mentioned, it's a little bit more tart, it's a little bit more unique, and given that current note on there, it made a lot more sense that it just stood out as being something that I haven't experienced from too many natural Ethiopian coffees in the past. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Citrus fruit, level 4. Again, they have that star fruit note listed on there. I'm going to say a little bit more generic of a tropical citric quality to it, and for that reason, it was justified there at the level 4 mark. Those are definitely secondary to the stone fruit, which is a level 4. I could not bump it up to level 5 largely because there isn't the level of cleanliness that I do hope for, or the obnoxious level of intensity that's often from more processed coffees that do score that level 5 for stone fruit. But outside of that, when it comes to a cleaner, natural representation of a stone fruit, I think that's probably going to be one of the highest level 4s we've ever scored. Nectarine notes, spot on point. I can definitely see that throughout the entirety of this coffee. Let's go and move on to level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Consistent again in what we've usually experienced from Coffea Circulor, not the brightest experience within this coffee. And I expected it might have skewed unbalanced, but given my very long history with having had so many of Coffea Circulor's coffees, I've noticed that it's not too often that coffees are necessarily funky or fermenty, and it hinders the experience of the cleanliness in that regard. Or even then, it's not always overly acidic or unbalanced in that sense. It's usually just strange. So this coffee didn't have any of those strange characteristics to it, especially pertaining to the acidity. So level 3 works for me. We'll keep that toned down on this one. Florality level 3. I don't have a great floral descriptor of this one. Again, it's a little bit more of a, I want to say, slightly perfumey floral quality to it, and a little bit more of a red sense. So not the cleanest floral quality within this coffee. Spice level 3, I can't shake that there's that spiced bergamot characteristic to it. Even on the final day that we were brewing this coffee, I can say it was notable enough to the point where I bumped it up to the level 3 mark, and I think that hindered the experience of this one. Not enough to the points to knock points on the cleanliness, but enough to the point where I think it held this coffee back from being maybe one of my favorite natural Ethiopian coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. All right, final thing we're discussing, body level 2, lighter bodied cup of coffee. Very interesting given that I did make this tasting wheel, I want to say right after or right before the Kaburi, and seeing the comparison between the wash and the natural, having the wash be a little bit heavier bodied was kind of interesting, but level 2 is where we opted to put them. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one had some extremely high highs at its very best. This coffee would have easily been one of my favorite natural processed Ethiopian coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. But I really have to keep in mind the strong characteristics that did take away from the experience of this one. That spiced bergamot characteristic that is just so prominent in so many of Coffea Circulor's coffees did hinder the experience on this one enough to the point where it did hold it back from reaching that specific, we'll say, milestone, that specific goal that I'm looking for within a coffee like this. Outside of that, though, it's unique because the fruit characteristics that do come from this coffee can present in a slightly Kenyan characteristic, while at the same time very much in a more washed Ethiopian characteristic that's presenting in terms of the intensity, all at the same time still offering such a high level of cleanliness for what this coffee is. But it's just held back by that one specific thing that didn't give this coffee the most transparent or straightforward experience. If anything, it made for an inconsistent experience and a more unusual experience. But that's kind of the experience you can get from Coffea Circulor sometimes. Sometimes you roll the dice and it turns out really well. And sometimes you roll the dice and you get 4 exceptional days and 4 days where you're kind of frustrated that the coffee isn't as exceptional as the other 4 days that you did experience. So make of that what you will. I do have to say at the end, it was one of the more enjoyable experiences that we did have from this recent run of Coffea Circulor coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you know exactly what I'm referencing when I say that spiced characteristic of these Coffea Circulor coffees and that doesn't bother you, then you are rewarded on the back end by a wonderfully fruit-forward experience. The stone fruits in this one are some of the best I've experienced from a natural processed Ethiopian coffee this year, by a significant margin. In addition to that, the other fruit characteristics that are presented within this one are unique and fun as well. So you get a lot of fun fruit qualities to this one throughout the entirety of it, with a slightly cleaner and defined presentation of all of those as well. None of which present in a heavier or overbearing sense, with a even level of brightness to it. So a lot of positives to take away from this one. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one as well, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Alo Bembe NX, natural processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.